The train groaned, a beast of iron and steam surrendering to the vast, white silence. It hissed a final, weary sigh, its vaporous breath mingling with the falling snow and vanishing into the flat, gray sky. For a long moment, that was the only sound in Dusty Hollow. Then came the metallic clank of a door, and Lena Callahan stepped onto the platform, her worn leather boots sinking into a fresh layer of powder. The cold was a physical blow, sharper and more personal than any she had known in the humid air of New Orleans. It stole the warmth from her lungs and turned her cheeks to stone. She clutched the thin wool of her coat, a garment made for milder winters, and pulled the collar tighter around her neck. In one hand, she held a single carpet bag, its fabric faded and its handles frayed. It contained everything she owned in the world: 2 changes of clothes, a small pouch of coins that felt lighter with every mile the train had traveled, her mother's silver locket, and a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Those letters, filled with careful prose and promising a new beginning, were the reason she was standing here, 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, shivering in a place that felt like the edge of the earth. Her eyes scanned the empty platform. There was only the station master, a stout man with a beard caked in ice, rolling a mail cart toward the locomotive. No welcoming party, no friendly face, just the wind, a lonely mourner whistling around the corners of the small depot, a knot of anxiety, which had been a constant companion on the long journey, tightened in her stomach. She was a creature of contrasts, a fact that had defined her life. Her father's Irish blood had given her a complexion that freckled rather than tanned, and eyes the color of moss after a rain. But her mother's Mexican heritage had shaped the elegant arch of her eyebrows, the high line of her cheekbones, and the thick, raven-black hair she kept pinned in a severe bun at the nape of her neck. In the vibrant, stratified society of New Orleans, she had been an exotic curiosity, never quite fitting in with the pale-skinned Creole belles or the fiery Spanish ladies. She was always something in between, a lovely, unsettling melody played in a key no one could quite name. And after the trouble, that difference had become a stain. The trouble, it wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow, suffocating collapse. Her father, a dreamer who built a small shipping business on hope and handshakes, had been ruined by a trusted partner. The scandal had been quiet but devastating, whispered in parlors and drawing rooms. The Callahans were finished, and Lena, at 22, with no dowry, and a name now associated with failure and poor judgment, became a social ghost. The invitations stopped. The suitors vanished. The world she knew turned its back, its judgment as cold and silent as the snow now gathering on her shoulders. Escape had come in the form of an advertisement in a newspaper, placed by a Mr. Alistair Finch, a merchant in Dusty Hollow, Wyoming territory. He sought a respectable lady of good character to serve as a companion for his aging mother and to assist with his ledgers. He had offered a modest wage, room, and board. To Lena, it was more than a job. It was a lifeline. Their correspondence had been proper, formal, and, for Lena, filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope. She had written of her skills in bookkeeping, of her quiet disposition, of her desire for a simple, honorable life. She had been careful not to mention the shadows of her past, nor the specifics of her appearance. She had presented herself as the kind of woman she thought he was looking for: plain, serviceable, and grateful. A blank slate on which a new life could be written. Miss Callahan, the voice, thin and reedy, cut through the wind. She turned to see a man standing at the far end of the platform. He was of middling height, with a narrow face and spectacles perched on a sharp nose. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a bowler hat, looking conspicuously out of place, like a city pigeon that had found itself among prairie hawks. This had to be him. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost warmed her. She forced a small, polite smile. "Mr. Finch, it is I. I am so pleased to finally make your acquaintance." She walked toward him, her bag seeming to grow heavier with each step. As she drew closer, she saw his expression change. It was a subtle shift, but unmistakable. The polite, expectant look on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a dawning look of appraisal. His gaze traveled from the top of her head down to her worn boots, lingering for a moment on the lines of her face. The faint smile on his lips didn't just disappear. It was retracted, pulled back like a turtle's head into its shell. "You are Miss Lena Callahan?" he asked again, his tone now laced with a thread of disbelief. "I am, sir," she said, her own smile faltering. The knot of anxiety returned, colder and tighter than before. He cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze and looking out at the snow-swept expanse beyond the tracks. "I see. Your letters. They did not prepare me." "Prepare you?" Sir Lena's voice was barely a whisper. She could feel the blood draining from her face, the cold now seeping deep into her bones. "Mr. Finch finally met her eyes, and his were as cold and gray as the winter sky. There was no malice in them, which somehow made it worse. There was only a calm, dispassionate finality. Miss Callahan. Dusty Hollow is a small town, a simple town. People here have certain expectations. My business, my family's good name, relies on upholding a standard of propriety, of fitting in." He gestured vaguely with a gloved hand. "I had envisioned someone different, someone more in keeping with the local temperament, a woman of plain and simple stock." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, sharp and cruel as icicles. "You are too dark, too foreign, too noticeable." She was not the blank slate he had expected. She was a canvas already painted in colors he found unsettling. Lena stood frozen, the carpet bag a dead weight at her side. She could feel the station master's curious gaze on her back. This was a scene she had played out 100 times in her mind, in different settings, with different people. The moment of judgment, the quiet dismissal. She had fled 1,000 miles only to find the same closed door, the same look in a stranger's eyes. "I am a hard worker. Mr. Finch," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. "My ledgers are impeccable. I am quiet and cause no trouble." "I believe my character is beyond reproach." "I do not doubt your character, Miss," he replied, a hint of impatience coloring his tone. "But character is not always visible. Appearance, however, is. You would be a subject of gossip, of speculation. My mother is a delicate woman. I cannot have our household disturbed by unnecessary talk." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, leather-bound wallet. "This has been a regrettable misunderstanding. A long and fruitless journey for you, I am sure. Allow me to offer something for your trouble, and for the cost of a return ticket on the morning train." He held out a few bills. The gesture was meant to be one of transactional decency, but to Lena, it felt like the deepest insult of all. He was not just rescinding a job offer. He was trying to erase her, to pay her off and send her back into the void from which she had come. She looked at the money, then back at his impassive face. Something inside her, a small, resilient core of pride that had survived the ruin in New Orleans, hardened. She would not take his charity. She would not let him purchase her humiliation. "That will not be necessary. Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low but clear. "I will manage on my own." She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met his gaze without flinching. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, perhaps even a sliver of respect, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture, and returned the money to his wallet. "As you wish," he said, tipping his hat with curt formality. "I wish you well." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps brisk and purposeful, leaving her alone on the platform. Lena stood motionless, watching him go until his dark coat was swallowed by the swirling snow. The train gave a loud blast of its whistle, a final, mournful cry, and began to slowly chug away from the station, pulling the last of her old life with it. Soon, it too was gone, and the silence that descended was absolute. It was a silence that spoke of emptiness, of immense, indifferent space. She was a tiny, solitary figure in a vast, white world. The hope that had sustained her for weeks had been extinguished as easily as a candle in the wind. The letters in her bag were now just paper and ink, their promises turned to ash. She was adrift, anchorless, in a place that had rejected her before she had even set foot on its main street. The familiar, crushing weight of not belonging settled upon her, heavier and colder than the snow-laden sky. For a time that felt both fleeting and eternal. Lena remained on the snow-dusted platform, a statue carved from disbelief. The world had shrunk to the space she occupied, the biting wind her only companion. But the cold was a merciless shepherd, nudging her back to life, reminding her that to stand still was to freeze, both in body and in spirit. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like swallowing shards of glass, she forced her legs to move. She stepped off the platform and onto the wide, rutted track that served as Dusty Hollow's main street. The town was a gash of raw timber and stone cut into the endless white. A double row of false-fronted buildings faced each other across the thoroughfare, their shoulders hunched against the snow. There was a general store, its windows displaying sacks of flour and bolts of calico, a blacksmith's forge, from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed with lonely industry, and a saloon, its bat-wing doors ominously silent, a single plume of dirty smoke rising from its chimney. Everything was functional, stark, stripped of ornament. It was a place built for survival, not for welcome. Her boots crunched in the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the muffled air. She kept her eyes fixed on the far end of the street, on the point where the town dissolved back into the unforgiving wilderness. She walked with a rigid posture, a discipline learned in the drawing rooms of New Orleans, where a woman's worth was measured by her grace under scrutiny. Do not show weakness. Do not show fear. Let them look. And they did look. Her first trial came as she drew level with the saloon. A cluster of men were gathered on the covered boardwalk, their bodies slouched in attitudes of bored indolence, their faces shielded by the low brims of their hats. They were not drinking, not at this hour, but simply existing, watching the slow progress of the day. Her appearance was a sudden, unexpected diversion. Heads lifted. Conversations paused. A silence fell over the group, a silence of pure, undiluted appraisal. She could feel their eyes on her like a physical touch, tracing the lines of her unfamiliar coat, the dark sweep of her hair, the way she carried herself. She was a different species, a bird of strange plumage that had mistakenly flown into a roost of common sparrows. A low whistle cut the air, sharp and insolent. "Well now," a gravelly voice drawled, loud enough for her to hear clearly. "Look what the afternoon train saw fit to deliver." Lena's jaw tightened. She kept walking, her pace even, her gaze forward. Don't look, don't acknowledge. To react was to give them power. Another voice, younger and rougher, chimed in. "Ain't from these parts, that's a certainty." Then came the laugh. It wasn't a sound of mirth. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement that held no warmth, only a shared, smug understanding. It was the sound of a pack, closing ranks and identifying an outsider. She felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, a hot tide of shame that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a feeling she knew intimately, the burning humiliation of being made a spectacle. "Got a bit of that Spanish look to her, I'd wager," a third man commented, his words casual, as if he were discussing the quality of a horse. He didn't mean it as a compliment. In this land of pale-skinned settlers from the east and north, it was a mark of difference, a brand. The men's murmurs followed her as she moved past, a low, buzzing cloud of speculation. She didn't catch all the words, only fragments that stung like wind-flung ice, too pretty for her own good. What's her business here? Ain't the type to last a winter. Each phrase was a small, sharp stone thrown at her back. She did not flinch. She did not hurry her steps. Outwardly, she was a model of composure, a lady of quiet dignity. But inside, a fire was building. It was not the clean, hot flame of righteous anger. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. It required a sense of security, a belief that you had a right to be angry. Hers was a different kind of fire. It was the slow, acidic burn of helplessness, of a spirit being relentlessly eroded. It was the familiar, agonizing blaze of knowing, with absolute certainty, that she did not belong. This feeling, this terrible sense of otherness, was the true ghost that haunted her. It had shadowed her through the sun-drenched courtyards of her New Orleans girlhood, where her classmates whispered about her mother's family. It had sat beside her in empty chairs at cotillions after her family's fall from grace. Now, it had followed her here, to this frozen outpost at the end of the world. She had crossed a continent only to discover that she could not outrun herself. Her walk down the main street was a gauntlet of silent judgment. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store paused, her broom still, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. 2 children, bundled in so many layers they looked like small, round barrels, stopped their play to point and stare. From a lace-curtained window above the assayer's office, she saw the pale, curious face of another woman peer out before quickly retreating, as if the mere act of being seen observing was a breach of etiquette. No one smiled, no one nodded. Each silent gaze reinforced the verdict, Mr. Finch had delivered on the platform, "You are not one of us." Finally, she reached the end of the street, where the last of the buildings gave way to open space. A large livery stable stood there, its wide doors slightly ajar, releasing the warm, earthy smells of hay and horse. Beside it was a long, wooden water trough, its surface thick with ice, its purpose suspended by the season. It seemed a fitting place to rest. It was a place of work, not of society. Horses, she thought with a flicker of bitter humor, were less judgmental than men. She moved toward it, grateful to be out of the direct line of sight of the main street. She sank down onto the frozen edge of the trough, her legs suddenly weak, her composure beginning to crack now that she was no longer on display. She set her carpetbag down in the snow beside her. The silence here was different. It was filled with the gentle sounds of the stable, the soft snort of a horse, the rustle of straw, the creak of old wood. It was a comforting, honest sort of quiet. She pulled her thin gloves off with her teeth, her fingers numb and stiff. She tucked her hands under her arms, trying to coax some life back into them. The wind whipped a strand of black hair across her face, and she let it stay there, a veil between her and this harsh, unwelcoming world. For the first time since stepping off the train, she allowed the full weight of her situation to crash down upon her. Rejected, mocked, penniless, alone. The words were a litany of despair in her mind. Mr. Finch's dismissal had been a sharp, clean cut. The men's laughter had been a blunter, more brutal wound. Both had delivered the same message. She was an anomaly, an error, a thing to be corrected and sent away. The morning train. The thought was a small, flickering light in the vast darkness of her thoughts. She could leave. She could endure this one night, somehow. And in the morning, she would be gone. She would erase herself from Dusty Hollow as completely as Mr. Finch had wished to. She would get on that train and go. Somewhere. Anywhere but here. The thought was followed by a cold, practical dread. If you still have the money. With fumbling, frozen fingers. She opened her reticule and took out the small, worn leather pouch that held her savings. She untied the drawstring and poured the contents into her lap. A few silver dollars, a handful of smaller coins. It was the sum of her worldly wealth. carefully hoarded over months, the last remnant of the life she had left behind. She began to count, her lips moving silently. She knew the fare for the journey west. The return trip would be the same. As she counted, her heart sank with each coin. The final tally was a cruel joke. It was not enough, not nearly enough. After paying for her ticket to get here, she had enough for perhaps a third of the journey back east, enough to get her stranded in some other, equally unforgiving town in the middle of nowhere. She stared at the coins in her lap, the cold metal seeming to burn through the fabric of her skirt. The faint hope of the morning train sputtered and died, leaving her in an even deeper darkness. She was not just unwelcome here. She was trapped. A dry, silent sob caught in her throat. She would not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. Tears were a surrender, and she had nothing left to give. Instead, she carefully scooped the coins back into the pouch, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled the drawstring tight. The fire inside her had burned down to cold, hard embers. The fight was gone, replaced by a profound and terrifying emptiness. She leaned her head back against the icy wood of the trough, closed her eyes, and listened to the lonely sound of the wind. The sun, a pale, defeated wafer in the winter sky, began its slow descent, bleeding hues of pale orange and bruised violet across the western horizon. The world was awash in a cold, ethereal light that made the snowdrifts glow and turned the shadows into long, blue rivers. With the fading light came a more profound cold, a deep, predatory chill that seeped through the soles of Lena's boots and crept up her spine. She sat hunched on the edge of the frozen trough, her body a tight knot of misery, her mind a desolate landscape mirroring the one around her. The world had gone quiet, save for the whisper of the wind and the occasional soft stamp or nicker from within the livery stable. It was from the stable's dark maw that a figure emerged, leading a tall bay horse. Lena tensed, her entire body going rigid. Her first instinct was to shrink into herself, to make herself smaller, invisible. She braced for another round of stares, another volley of dismissive words or mocking laughter. But the man didn't look at her. Not at first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an unhurried economy that spoke of a deep familiarity with his own strength. A heavy sheepskin-lined coat was pulled tight against the cold, and a worn felt hat was tugged low on his brow, shadowing his face. He led the horse to a hitching post a few yards from where she sat, his movements patient and sure. The horse, sensing the end of its work, lowered its head and blew a great cloud of steam into the frigid air. Lena watched him from beneath her lashes, her heart hammering a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was an expert in being observed, and she knew the subtle signs of judgment, pity, and contempt. She saw none of them in this man. He was absorbed in his task, his attention focused entirely on the animal. She watched his gloved hands, competent and steady, as they worked the buckles of the saddle cinch. The creak of the leather was a loud, intimate sound in the twilight stillness. He swung the heavy saddle off the horse's back with a smooth, practiced motion and set it on the rail. He ran a hand down the horse's damp flank, murmuring something too low for her to hear, a quiet communion between man and beast. Only when the horse was unsaddled and tended to did he finally turn his head and acknowledge her presence. His gaze was not the insolent stare of the men at the saloon, nor the cold, appraising glance of Mr. Finch. It was something else entirely. It was direct, steady, and brief. His eyes, the color of slate under a winter sky, simply registered her. A woman, alone, with a traveling bag, sitting by a frozen trough as night fell. His expression didn't change. There was no surprise, no curiosity, not even pity. It was a look of quiet, factual assessment, as if he were noting the change in the weather. Then he turned away, retrieving a canvas bucket from inside the stable. He worked the pump handle until water gushed out, the sound of it splashing into the bucket a shock in the frozen world. He let the horse drink its fill, his hand resting on the animal's neck. Lena found she couldn't look away. There was a profound peacefulness in his actions, a simple rightness that stood in stark contrast to the churning chaos inside her. He was a part of this place, as rooted and elemental as the timber of the buildings and the vast, cold sky above. He belonged. When the horse was done, the man unhooked a dented metal canteen from the saddle horn. He walked toward her, his stride long and even. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She instinctively braced herself, her hands clenching into fists in her lap. But he stopped a respectful distance away and simply held out the canteen. His silence was more unnerving than any words could have been. She stared at the canteen, then up at his shadowed face. She could see him more clearly now. His features were stark, carved by wind and sun, with a strong jaw darkened by a day's worth of stubble. He was not a handsome man in the refined way she was used to, but his face had a rugged integrity, a history written in the fine lines around his eyes. She did not move. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. He made no sign of impatience. He simply stood there, holding out the canteen, a silent, unwavering offer. Finally, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the cold metal as her hand closed around it. The weight of it was surprising, a solid, tangible thing in a world that had become abstract and hostile. She lifted it to her lips, the water inside shockingly cold but clean, and she drank, the simple act of quenching her thirst so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. She fought them back, swallowing hard. She lowered the canteen, her hand trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He gave a short, single nod, accepting her thanks as a simple fact, not something requiring a flowery response. He took the canteen back and hooked it onto his belt. "Room to be had at May's place," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as steady and unadorned as the rest of him. "Last house on the street. She runs a clean boarding house. She'll have a fire going." He gestured with his head down the street, in the direction from which she had come. The information was delivered plainly, without suggestion or command. It was a map offered to someone who was lost. Lena stared at him, bewildered. The kindness, so simple and unasked for, was disorienting. It made no sense. People in this town had already made their judgment of her. Why was he different? "I am Jack Delaney," he said, seeming to understand her need for a name, a piece of information to anchor this strange encounter. "Foreman up at the Bar T Ranch." The introduction hung in the air. He offered no more, asked for nothing in return. He had stated his name and his purpose, and that was enough. "Lena Callahan," she found herself replying, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue. "Miss Callahan," he acknowledged with another brief nod. The silence stretched for a moment, filled only by the rising wind. Lena's mind raced, trying to reconcile this man's quiet decency with the hostility she had faced all afternoon. The question she had been holding back finally broke free, a plea for understanding. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" Jack Delaney looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over the snow-covered street and up toward the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. He seemed to consider the question, not as if it were difficult, but as if it were a matter of finding the plainest, truest words. When he looked back at her, his eyes were clear and direct. "Because no one," he said, his voice even and low, "should be left out in the snow like this." And that was all. It was not an offer of friendship. It was not a judgment on her circumstances or on the people who had wronged her. It was a simple, profound statement of principle, as solid and unshakable as the frozen earth beneath their feet. In a world of shifting social codes and cruel whispers, he had offered her a single, simple truth. Before she could form a response, he turned, took the reins of his horse, and led the animal into the warm, lantern-lit darkness of the stable. The great wooden door slid shut with a soft thud, leaving her once again in the growing twilight. She was alone, But the quality of her solitude had changed. The crushing weight of despair had lifted, replaced by something fragile and new. It was not yet hope, but it was the soil in which hope might grow. She looked down at her hands, which she had wrapped around the spot on her skirt where the canteen had briefly rested, as if to preserve its phantom warmth. Then she looked down the street, toward the last house, where a faint yellow light had just appeared in a window, a tiny beacon in the vast, encroaching night, with a deep breath that filled her lungs with the cold, clean air of the prairie. Lena Callahan stood up, picked up her bag, and began to walk toward it. The walk to the last house on the street was a journey through a landscape of doubt. With every step, Lena's mind warred with itself. The quiet, grounding presence of Jack Delaney was a fact, as solid as the canteen he had offered her. But the laughter of the men at the saloon was also a fact, as was the cold finality in Mr. Finch's eyes, which was the true dusty hollow, the one that offered a stranger a drink of water, or the one that judged her on sight. She feared she already knew the answer, and that Jack Delaney was the exception, not the rule. The house, when she reached it, was different from its neighbors. It was smaller, set back a little farther from the street, and made of weathered gray clapboard that seemed to have settled comfortably into the earth. It lacked the proud, false front of the commercial buildings, possessing instead a simple, honest porch with two ladder-backed chairs sitting empty, patiently waiting for a spring that felt a lifetime away. A warm, yellow light glowed from a single downstairs window, a square of welcome in the vast, blue twilight. It looked less like a boarding house and more like a home. For a long moment, she stood at the foot of the 3 short steps, her courage failing her. To knock on this door was to risk the final rejection, the one that would leave her with no other options but the frozen street. Taking a breath so deep it ached in her chest, she forced herself up the steps. The wood groaned softly under her weight. She raised a numb, gloved hand and knocked. The sound was a sharp, definitive rap that seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long time. She heard movement from within, the scuff of a shoe on a wooden floor, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door swung inward, and a woman stood silhouetted against the warm light of the interior. She was tall and stately, with her graying hair pinned neatly in a bun. Her face, framed by the lamplight, was a canvas of calm strength, her dark skin holding the warm tones of polished walnut. Her eyes, deep-set and intelligent, took in Lena's appearance in a single, sweeping glance. This was not the quick, dismissive appraisal of Mr. Finch or the leering curiosity of the saloon patrons. This was a look of profound, knowing assessment. It was the look of a woman who had seen much of the world and was not easily surprised. Yes, the woman's voice was a low, smooth contralto, a sound like warm molasses. I was told, Lena began, her own voice thin and uncertain. A Mr. Delaney said you might have a room. The woman's expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. She knew Jack Delaney. She stepped back, holding the door wider. The wind has a bite tonight. Come in out of the cold. The invitation was simple, a statement of practicality. But for Lena, it was a profound relief. She stepped across the threshold, bringing a swirl of cold air and fine snow in with her. The woman closed the door, and the sound of the bolt sliding back into place felt like a seal being set against the hostile world outside. The warmth of the house enveloped her instantly. The main room was simply furnished but immaculately clean. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, brewing tea, and beeswax. It was the scent of safety. Sit, the woman said, gesturing to a simple wooden chair near the fire. You look half frozen. Lena did as she was told. Sinking into the chair, she set her bag by her feet and began to work at the buttons of her coat with clumsy, uncooperative fingers. The warmth from the hearth was so intense it was almost painful on her frozen skin. The woman moved to the stove, her movements efficient and graceful. "I am May," she said, without turning around. "Maeve Johnson. Most folks just call me May." She poured steaming water from a kettle into a tin mug. "Jack was right to send you. Not a fit night to be out." She brought the mug to Lena and placed it in her hands. The heat seeped through her gloves, a welcome shock that started a slow thaw deep inside her. "Tea. It'll help with the chill." Lena wrapped her hands around the mug, cradling it as if it were a precious treasure. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." "May," the woman corrected gently. She took the chair opposite Lena, her posture erect, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Now, you're looking for a room." It was not a question so much as an opening. May's dark eyes were steady, waiting. She was not a woman for small talk. Lena knew she had to explain herself, but the words caught in her throat. The humiliation of her encounter with Mr. Finch was still a raw wound. "I had an arrangement," Lena said, choosing her words carefully. "For employment. It seems there was a misunderstanding." May nodded slowly, a knowing look on her face. "A misunderstanding with Mr. Finch, I'd wager." Lena's head snapped up in surprise. May offered a small, wry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is a small town. Child. News travels faster than a blizzard, especially when it concerns a newcomer. I saw you walk down the street. I saw the way the men at the saloon looked at you, and I know Alistair Finch. He's a man who values appearances above all else." There was no judgment in her tone, only a statement of fact. In that moment, Lena felt a profound sense of kinship with this woman. May, with her dark skin and quiet dignity, surely knew what it was to be judged by the narrow standards of a town like this. She understood, in a way no one else could, the nature of Lena's rejection. "I have a little money," Lena said, finding her voice again. "Not much, but enough for a few nights, I hope." May considered this for a moment, her gaze drifting from Lena's face to her worn coat and her single, shabby bag. "I run a boarding house, it's true, but I am a widow, and my hands are not what they once were. The work of a house this size is considerable. I have a room, yes, a small one in the back. It's not much used. Dusty." She paused, her eyes meeting Lena's again. "Clear and direct. I can offer you that room, and a place at my table, in exchange for work. My eyesight is failing, and the mending piles up, and I confess, I grow tired of my own cooking. A pair of young, capable hands would be a great help." It was not charity. It was a bargain, a fair exchange. It was an offer that allowed Lena to keep the last shreds of her pride intact. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, hot and sudden. She blinked them back fiercely. "I am a very neat seamstress," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I learned to cook in a New Orleans kitchen." May's smile finally reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in a fan of fine lines. "Then I believe we have an arrangement, Miss Callahan." The room was just as May had described it, small, dusty, and tucked away at the back of the house, with a single narrow window that looked out onto a snow-filled yard. It contained a simple iron bed frame, a small washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a rickety wooden chair. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling like funeral shrouds. It was a forgotten space, a room without a purpose. But to Lena, it was a sanctuary. May provided her with a bucket of hot water, a stack of clean rags, and a broom. And then she left her alone. The act of cleaning was a balm to Lena's frayed spirit. She tied a scarf over her hair and set to work with a focused energy she hadn't felt all day. She swept the floor, the broom whispering against the wooden planks, sending dust motes dancing in the single beam of lamplight she had brought with her. She wiped down the bed frame, the washstand, the windowsill, scrubbing away years of neglect. The physical labor was grounding, the simple, repetitive motions a way to reclaim a sense of control over her own life. With each swipe of the rag, She felt as if she were wiping away not just the dust of the room, but the grime of the day's humiliations. When the room was clean, May returned with a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a stack of neatly folded linens that smelled of lavender and sunshine. Together, they made the bed. Finally, the room was ready. Lena stood in the center of the small space, the air now clean and smelling faintly of soap and lavender. She looked at the neatly made bed, the clean floor, the washstand gleaming in the lamplight. It was hers, a space that she had earned, that she had made her own. She walked to the bed and set her carpet bag down on the floor beside it. For the first time since she could remember, she was not a guest in someone else's house, not a transient figure in a temporary lodging. This was not a final destination. She knew. It was not a home. But for the first time, as she let go of the frayed handle of her bag, she felt that this place, this small, clean room in the house of a kind stranger, could be a stopping place, a station on a long and difficult journey where she could finally rest. The days that followed settled into a quiet, comforting rhythm. Lena rose before dawn, helping May in the kitchen. She learned the simple, hearty cuisine of the prairie stews, sourdough bread, baked beans. In the afternoons, she would sit by the fire in the main room, her lap filled with a basket of mending. She patched the worn knees of a farmhand's trousers, restitched the seams of May's aprons, and darned socks until her fingers were sore. She was a quiet, diligent presence in the house, and May seemed to appreciate her work and her lack of fuss. They spoke little, but a comfortable understanding grew between them, a silent bond of shared resilience. Jack Delaney came by a few times. His visits were always brief and purposeful. Once, he brought a haunch of venison for May's larder. Another time, he came to fix a loose shutter that had been banging in the wind. He never stayed long. He would greet May with a respectful ma'am, and Lena with a quiet, steady nod and a Miss Callahan. He did not engage her in conversation, but she often felt his eyes on her as she sat with her sewing. It was not an intrusive gaze, but a watchful, contemplative one. He seemed to be taking her measure, observing the steady competence of her hands, the quiet focus in her eyes. He was a man who spoke in actions, not words, and his quiet presence in May's house felt like a silent, ongoing endorsement of her right to be there. Then, one afternoon, nearly a week after her arrival, he appeared at the door with a large, lumpy bundle wrapped in burlap under his arm. The snow had started to fall again, and his hat and the shoulders of his coat were white with it. He stamped the snow from his boots on the porch and entered, bringing the sharp, clean scent of winter into the warm room. "Jack," May said, looking up from the account book she was puzzling over. "It's a cold one to be out." "It is," he agreed. He looked at Lena, who had paused, her needle hovering over a torn shirt. "Miss Callahan." "Mr. Delaney," she replied, her heart giving a small, unexpected flutter. He walked over to her and placed the burlap-wrapped bundle on the floor beside her chair. "May mentioned you have a good hand with a needle," he said, his voice its usual low rumble. Lena looked down at the bundle, then back up at him, a question in her eyes. He nudged the bundle with the toe of his boot. "The men at the ranch, their work clothes are in a poor state, torn on wire, worn through at the elbows. We're not a fancy outfit, but a man works better when he's not letting the wind in." He looked at her directly, his slate-gray eyes serious. "I would consider it a favor if you would look them over, and I would pay you for your time. Of course, a fair price." Lena stared at him, then at the bundle. She reached down and untied the twine that held the burlap together. Inside was a heap of rough, stained fabric heavy canvas trousers, thick flannel shirts, denim jackets. They were the clothes of hard-working men, torn and battered by the demands of the land. It was more than just a pile of mending. It was an offer of employment. It was the first real work she had been offered in Dusty Hollow. It was not given out of pity, but out of a practical need. Jack Delaney was not looking at her appearance. He was looking at her skill, He was trusting her with the well-being of his men, in this small but essential way. She reached out and touched the rough fabric of a canvas jacket. It was stiff and cold from its journey through the snow, and it smelled of the outdoors, of horse and hay and hard work. A slow warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar she almost gasped. It was the feeling of being seen, not as a curiosity, not as a problem, but as a person with a skill, a value. She looked up at Jack Delaney, whose shadowed face was watching her, waiting for her answer. "I would be glad to, Mr. Delaney," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I would be glad to." The large burlap sack of mending was a world unto itself. Lena carried it to her small room, the scent of horse, sweat, and winter air clinging to the rough fabric, and spread the contents out on her bed. It was a cartography of hard labor. There were flannel shirts with elbows worn thin as paper, denim trousers with knees blown out, and heavy canvas jackets with wicked, L-shaped tears where a man had caught himself on a nail or a branch. Some garments bore the ghosts of previous repairs clumsy, thick stitches made by a fumbling hand with a dull needle. Each piece told a story of effort and exhaustion. For Lena, it was a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. This was not the fine embroidery she had learned in the sunlit parlors of New Orleans, but a more fundamental art, the art of restoration. She worked by the light of a kerosene lamp late into the night and through the long, quiet afternoons. Her hands, which the ladies of New Orleans had praised for their delicate touch on silk and lace, proved just as adept with coarse denim and thick-gauge thread. She did not merely patch. She saw the logic in the weave of the fabric, the lines of stress where a seam was most likely to fail. She darned the thinning elbows of the shirts not with simple cross-hatching, but with a fine, interwoven pattern that was stronger than the original material. For the ripped trousers, she harvested fabric from the tail of a ruined shirt to create an inner lining, then stitched the tear shut with a row of tiny, almost invisible backstitches, making the repair smooth on the inside so it wouldn't chafe the wearer. She replaced missing buttons with new ones carved from a piece of deer antler May had kept in a jar. Her needle became an extension of her will, moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing to watch. In this small, focused world of thread and cloth, she found a sense of order and purpose that had long been absent from her life. When Jack Delaney returned 3 days later to collect the finished work, she had it all neatly folded and stacked, wrapped in a clean flour sack. He untied the top and pulled out the first item, a heavy jacket. He ran his fingers over the place where a long tear had split the shoulder. His expression, as usual, was unreadable, but she saw him turn the fabric over, examining both the outside and the inside of her repair. He held it up to the light. He said nothing, but he looked from the jacket to her, and his eyes held a new light, a flicker of deep, quiet respect. He paid her the agreed-upon price without a word of haggling, the coins feeling heavy and real in her palm. It was the first money she had truly earned in her life. The clothes went back to the Bar T Ranch, and soon, a new current began to flow through the slow-moving life of Dusty Hollow. It started at the ranch itself, with men pulling on their mended shirts and marveling at the strength of the repairs. A cowboy named young Billy Peterson, known more for his boasts than his brains, was heard to exclaim that his jacket was now more bulletproof than an iron stove. The sentiment, if not the science, was shared. The men who lived hard lives and depended on their gear understood the value of a job done right. The talk trickled into town. It was carried in by ranch hands coming in for supplies or a Saturday night drink. At the general store, one of them showed Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, the elbow of his flannel shirt. "Look at that," he'd said. "She fixed it so well I can't even feel the patch." Whispers began to attach themselves to Lena. They were not, at first, unkind. They were whispers of grudging admiration. The new woman, the one who kept to herself at May's place, had a skill, more than a skill, a gift. A phrase began to circulate, passed from the saloon to the smithy. From the porch of the general store to the sewing circles of the town's respectable ladies, she has hands of gold. But the admiration was always kept at a distance, filtered through the lens of her otherness. Her skill was acknowledged, but she, the person, was not. When people spoke of her, they rarely used her name. To the men, she was the new seamstress. To the women, who began to bring her small mending jobs, a child's torn dress, a husband's Sunday shirt, she was May's girl. And in the quieter, more candid conversations, she was given another title, one that coiled the town's appreciation and its prejudice into a single, cutting phrase, the mixed-blood seamstress. Lena heard the whispers. She felt the label settle upon her like a second skin. It was a constant, low-grade ache. They would praise her hands but ignore her heart. They would pay for her labor but refuse her name. It was a peculiar kind of acceptance, one that managed to be both a compliment and an insult, and it reminded her that her place here was conditional, built not on who she was, but on what she could do. The one constant, the one anchor in this shifting sea of conditional acceptance was Jack Delaney. The mending for the bar tea became a regular arrangement. Every week or two, he would appear at May's door with a new bundle of torn clothes and collect the finished ones. And every single time, he would look at her with his steady, slate-gray eyes and greet her with the same two words, Miss Callahan. He never shortened it. He never used a descriptor. He spoke her name plainly, respectfully, as if it were a solid, undeniable fact. Each time he said it, the sound was like a balm on the raw wound of the town's casual slights. He was giving her back a piece of herself that the others had tried to take away. Their interactions were always brief, limited to the business at hand. But in his consistent, unwavering courtesy, a silent conversation was taking place. He saw her, not the seamstress, not the outsider, but Lena Callahan, and for that, she felt a gratitude so profound it was almost a physical ache in her chest. One afternoon, as she was finishing the last of a bundle for the ranch, she found herself with a small, leftover square of fine, clean linen from one of May's old pillowcases. It was soft and smooth to the touch. An idea took root in her mind. A quiet, insistent urge to give something back, something more than just paid labor. It was a risk, a personal gesture in a relationship that had been defined by a respectful, professional distance. But the urge was too strong to ignore. That evening, by the flickering lamplight, she took out her finest needle and a spool of deep red thread. It was the color of holly berries, of a winter sunset, of blood and life. With painstaking care, she began to stitch his name onto the corner of the white linen square. Jackdelaney. The letters were sharp and elegant, a testament to the skill she possessed. It was a simple act, but it felt deeply significant. She was weaving her gratitude, her respect, into the very fibers of the cloth. He arrived 2 days later, his timing as reliable as the setting sun. The air was still and bitterly cold, and he brought the scent of pine and snow in with him. "Good afternoon, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Mr. Delaney," she replied, her voice softer than usual. She handed him the stack of neatly folded and mended clothes. He took them, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, a touch that sent a surprising jolt of warmth through her. He placed the pile on a nearby table and reached into his coat for his wallet. "Wait," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her heart was pounding. He paused, his hand halfway to his pocket, and looked at her, his expression questioning. With a trembling hand, she reached into her sewing basket and pulled out the small, neatly folded handkerchief. She held it out to him. It looked impossibly white and delicate in her hand. "This is for you," she said. "A small thank you for the work." He looked at the handkerchief, then at her face, then back at the small square of linen. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out and taking it from her. His large, work-roughened hands were surprisingly gentle as they unfolded the cloth. He saw the name, stitched in its stark red thread against the white field. And then he looked up at her. The room fell completely silent. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the frantic beat of Lena's own heart. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, and his gaze was more profound than any words could ever be. It was a look that stripped away everything else, the town, the whispers, the mending, the money. It was a look of pure, unvarnished acknowledgement. He saw the stitches, the hours of work, the carefully chosen color. He saw the gratitude. He saw the risk she had taken. He saw her. Time seemed to stretch and thin. Lena felt her cheeks flush under the intensity of his gaze, but she did not look away. She held his gaze, her breath held tight in her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a single, slow nod. It was not his usual curt, businesslike gesture. This nod was deliberate, freighted with an unspoken weight. It was an acceptance, a confirmation, an answer. Without breaking eye contact, he carefully folded the handkerchief back into its neat square. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tucked it into the inside pocket of his sheepskin coat, the pocket that rested over his heart. He gave her one last look, then picked up the bundle of mended clothes, turned, and walked out the door, leaving her standing in the warm, fire-lit room with the echo of his silence ringing in her ears. The town of Dusty Hollow had a heartbeat, and Lena Callahan was beginning to learn its rhythms. It beat in the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of freight wagons on the main street, and the low hum of conversation from the general store. In the weeks that followed her small gift to Jack Delaney, she found that she had become a part of that rhythm, albeit a dissonant one. Her skill with a needle and thread was no longer a rumor. It was an established fact. Her work became a new kind of currency. A rancher's wife, whose husband had praised the repairs on his jacket, stopped her on the street to ask if she could take in the bodice of a Sunday dress. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, quietly commissioned her to mend a batch of canvas tarps that had been damaged in transit. The coins she earned were carefully saved, a growing testament to her value. She was becoming not just a resident, but a resource. Yet, this acceptance was a cold and brittle thing. It was a transaction, not an embrace. The whispers had changed their tune, but they had not ceased. They now coiled around the regular, quiet visits of Jack Delaney. The sight of his tall frame walking to May's front door every week or so was a reliable source of speculation for the town's gossips. Lena would catch the whispers when she went to the store for flour or thread, a sudden silence falling over a pair of women as she approached, or a phrase caught on the edge of hearing as she passed. At May's place again. Always has a bundle, they say. A bundle of excuses, more like a man like that doesn't call on account of a few torn shirts. The insinuations were as sharp as her own needles. They stitched a narrative of her as a calculating seductress, a woman using her foreign charms to secure the protection of a respected man. The most cutting remarks came cloaked in a veneer of false concern. You have to be careful with their kind. One woman was heard to say to another over a barrel of pickles, their loyalties are complicated. You never know if their heart is true. Their kind. The phrase was a familiar ghost, a reminder that no matter how skillfully her hands worked, her blood would always be a subject of suspicion. She never let them see the sting. She would offer a polite, neutral nod to the whispering women and continue on her way, her face a calm, placid mask. Inside, however, the words were tiny barbs that caught and pulled. Her sanctuary remained the small house at the end of the street. With May, there were no whispers, no sideways glances. There was only a shared, quiet understanding. As the winter deepened, Lena's desire to contribute to their shared home grew. She took pride in the neat stacks of mended clothes, the savory stews simmered on the stove, the clean-swept floors. One afternoon, she noticed how the daylight struggled to get through the front room windows, filtered by the thin, yellowed curtains that had hung there for years. They were clean, but hopelessly frayed, and they cast a gloomy pall over the otherwise cheerful room. "May," she said, "I should like to make us new curtains." May looked up from the sock she was darning, her eyes magnified by a pair of spectacles. "These old things have seen better days." "That's true, but good fabric is dear." "The ladies at the church," Lena ventured. "I've heard they keep a charity barrel, scraps and remnants for quilting. There might be enough for a simple pair of curtains." "I could ask." May was silent for a long moment, her needle still. She looked at Lena, her expression thoughtful. "The ladies of the church are a particular flock. Child, their charity sometimes comes with a high price." "I will only be asking for scraps," Lena said, her voice more confident than she felt. "It is a reasonable request." May gave a slow nod. "Then go, but walk with your head held high." The church stood on a small rise at the opposite end of town, its white steeple a stark finger pointing at the gray sky. It was the town's moral center, the hub around which the respectable society of Dusty Hollow revolved. As Lena walked towards it, she felt the familiar tightening in her stomach. This was not the general store or the blacksmith's forge. This was the inner sanctum, the domain of the women who whispered about her behind their gloved hands. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The air was cold, smelling of old wood, wax, and something faintly cloying, like dried flowers. A half-dozen women were gathered in the meeting hall adjacent to the main sanctuary, seated around a large quilting frame. Their needles rose and fell in a steady, silent rhythm, as one. They stopped their work and looked up as she entered, their faces a gallery of polite, unwelcoming masks. At the head of the group, a woman sat slightly apart, not quilting, but sorting through a ledger. She was a thin, severe-looking woman in a dress the color of a storm cloud. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin taut across her cheekbones. Her mouth was a firm, thin line. Lena recognized her as Mrs. Beatrice Prentice, the wife of the town banker and the undisputed leader of the Ladies' Aid Society. Lena's heart sank. She had heard May mention the name. Mrs. Prentice was a cousin to Alistair Finch. Taking a steadying breath, Lena walked quietly toward the group. "Good afternoon, ladies." A few of the women murmured a response, but most simply stared. Mrs. Prentice looked up from her ledger, her pale blue eyes as cold as river ice. "Miss Callahan," she said, her voice thin and precise. "This is an unexpected visit. I apologize for the intrusion." "Mrs. Prentice," Lena began, her voice even and respectful. "I came to inquire on behalf of May Johnson. We are in need of some fabric to make new curtains for her front room. I was told the Ladies' Aid Society sometimes has remnants to spare for those in need." The silence in the room was absolute. Every woman had stopped her work, her eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Lena could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a heavy, judgmental pressure. "Mrs. Prentice set her pen down with deliberate care. She folded her hands on top of her ledger and bestowed upon Lena a smile. It was a masterpiece of social cruelty, a slight upward curve of the lips that conveyed no warmth, only a chilling sense of superiority. "The Ladies' Aid Society is indeed a charitable organization. Miss Callahan," she said, her voice as sweet and sharp as a shard of rock candy. "We provide for the deserving poor of this community. We clothe the orphans and comfort the widows. This," she gestured around the chilly hall, "is a house of God, and we do His work with open hearts." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Her gaze swept over Lena, from the neat coil of her dark hair to the hem of her simple, handmade dress. "However," she continued, her voice dropping to a more confidential, conspiratorial tone, "we must also be guardians of the moral character of our town. This is a house of purity. We believe that charity is best given to those of good and upright standing. Not everyone is welcome to partake of the Lord's bounty until they have made a full account of their past and have washed it clean. The meaning was unmistakable. The words were a silken dagger, slid neatly between Lena's ribs in full view of the town's matriarchs. It was an accusation and a conviction delivered in a single, pious breath. She was being publicly branded as morally unclean, her unnamed past a stain that made her unworthy of receiving even a handful of worthless fabric scraps. A faint gasp came from one of the younger women at the quilting frame. An older woman shot her a quelling look. Lena felt a familiar, cold wave wash over her. The air in the room seemed to thin, the faces of the women blurring at the edges. For a split second, she was no longer in the dusty, hollow church. She was 10 years old, standing in the sun-drenched schoolyard of a convent in New Orleans. A girl with blonde curls and a lace-trimmed dress named Celeste was standing before her, surrounded by a circle of friends. "My mother says your mother's people aren't proper Catholics," Celeste had announced, her voice piping and clear. "She says you can't ever really be clean in God's eyes." The sting of that long-ago moment was identical to the sting she felt now. The words were different, the accusations vaguer, but the core sentiment was the same. "You are not one of us. You are not pure. You do not belong." A fire, hot and sharp, flared in her chest, the urge to defend herself, to lash out, to demand what right this woman had to judge her. But a lifetime of such moments had taught her the futility of it. To argue would be to engage on their terms. To show her hurt would be to grant them a victory. So she did what she had learned to do at the age of 10. She let the hurt recede, packing it away in a deep, protected part of herself. She straightened her spine. She met Mrs. Prentice's cold, triumphant gaze, and she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not a forgiving smile. It was a small, quiet, and utterly impenetrable smile. It was a shield. It said, simply, "You cannot touch me." "I see," Lena said, her voice perfectly calm. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Mrs. Prentice. I apologize for taking up your valuable time." With a polite, graceful nod that included the entire room, she turned and walked out of the church. She did not hurry. She kept her back straight, her head held high, feeling the force of their collective stare on her like a physical weight until the heavy door closed behind her, shutting out their silent judgment. She stood for a moment on the church steps, the cold air a welcome shock on her warm cheeks. And then she began the long walk home. The silence that followed Lena's retreat from the church was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She threw herself into her work, her needle flying with a furious, precise energy. But the rhythm of the stitches could not drown out the echo of Mrs. Prentice's honeyed, venomous words. May watched her with worried eyes, her presence a quiet, constant support. But the wound was internal, a cold spot that the hearth's warmth could not reach. Jack Delaney arrived 3 days later, his regular visit to collect the ranch's mending. He found Lena by the fire, her back ramrod straight, her face pale and strained in the flickering light. He took in the scene, the fierce concentration on her sewing, the subtle tremor in her hands, the deep, bruised weariness in her eyes. He said his usual polite greeting, but his gaze lingered on her, perceptive and questioning. He looked at May, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent confirmation that something was wrong. He did not press. Instead, after concluding his business with May, he turned to Lena. "I'm riding up to the North Camp tomorrow at dawn," he said, his voice even. "Checking the herd before the next snow is due. The ride is long. I could use an extra pair of eyes." He paused, then added, "And it's past time you saw where all your hard work ends up." It was not an invitation to a social outing. It was a practical proposal, framed in work and purpose. Lena looked up, surprised. The thought of leaving the oppressive confines of the town, of breathing air that hadn't been poisoned by whispers and judgment, was a sudden, desperate thirst. Yet, the memory of her public humiliation made her hesitate. made her want to stay hidden in the safety of May's home. May, sensing her conflict, spoke from her chair. "The air will do you good. Child, go on." Lena looked at Jack's steady, impassive face. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet, unwavering offer. She gave a single, decisive nod. "I will be ready at dawn." The world before sunrise was a realm of deep blue and silver. Jack arrived with a second horse, a gentle, sure-footed mare. The town was asleep, its windows dark and blind, and leaving it behind felt like shrugging off a heavy, suffocating cloak. They rode north, into the vast, open country. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the creak of saddle leather, the soft crunch of the horses' hooves on the crusted snow, and the vast, whispering quiet of the plains. This was Jack's world. He rode with an easy, confident grace, a man perfectly in tune with his surroundings. He pointed out a distant butte, its flat top catching the first pale rays of the sun. He showed her the tracks of a coyote, a delicate, purposeful line stitched across the snow. He spoke little, but through his quiet gestures, he was showing her a different catechism, one written not in a book of rules and judgments, but on the face of the land itself. For the first time in months, Lena felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. Here, under the immense, indifferent sky, the petty cruelties of Dusty Hollow seemed to shrink, becoming small and insignificant. The North Camp was little more than a rough-hewn log cabin and a series of corrals hunkered down in a small, wind-sheltered valley. A handful of cowboys, their face chapped and weathered by the elements, stopped their work to watch them approach. Lena recognized them as the owners of the shirts she had mended. She saw the familiar flicker of surprise in their eyes, the same guarded curiosity she had grown so accustomed to. They nodded to Jack, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a shadow at his side. Jack dismounted and began his inspection of the herd, his conversation with the men a low murmur of practicalities: feed, water, the condition of the cattle. Lena stayed by her horse, feeling a renewed sense of her outsider status. Then, a commotion near the far fence drew their attention. One of the younger cowboys was waving his hat. "Boss, over here." Jack strode toward the fence, and Lena followed. Lying in the snow, separated from the main herd, was a newborn calf. It was a tiny, wretched thing, its dark coat matted with ice, its body trembling violently. Its mother stood nearby, lowing with a distressed, helpless cry. "Born in the night," one of the cowboys said, his voice flat with resignation. "Too late in the season, the cold's got him. He's a goner." The other men nodded in agreement. They saw a loss of profit, a harsh but common reality of ranching. Jack knelt, his gloved hand feeling the calf's neck. His face was grim. Lena looked at the small, shivering creature, at its desperate, shallow breaths. She saw not a financial loss, but a life flickering on the edge of extinction. She didn't think, she acted. She strode forward, past the silent, watching men. She knelt in the snow beside Jack, pulling off her thick woolen gloves. She placed her bare hands on the calf, feeling the shocking, deathly cold of its skin. Without a moment's hesitation, she unbuttoned her coat, the one good coat she owned, her last remaining piece of New Orleans respectability, and shrugged it off. She laid the warm, wool-lined garment over the calf's trembling body, wrapping it snugly around the shivering limbs. A stunned silence fell over the men. They stared, mouths agape, at this woman who had just sacrificed her own protection against the bitter cold for a dying animal. They saw her, kneeling in the frozen mud in her shirt sleeves, her face set with a fierce, maternal determination. "We need to get it warm. Rub its legs," she commanded, her voice clear and strong. She began to chafe the calf's front legs with her bare hands, her fingers quickly growing numb from the cold. "Get it breathing." For a second, no one moved. Then, Jack, a look of profound respect dawning on his face, began to rub the calf's other side. The spell was broken. One of the cowboys, a grizzled man whose canvas jacket she had patched the week before, wordlessly pulled a thick horse blanket from the fence and handed it to her to put under the calf. Another, the young one who had called out, ran to the cabin and returned with a bucket of warm water and some rough sacks. They worked as a team, a silent, focused unit. The men who had looked through her minutes before were now taking her lead, their hands working alongside hers. They saw not a mixed-blood seamstress, but a woman of grit and compassion. They saw the strength in her hands, a strength that went far beyond pushing a needle. Slowly, miraculously, the calf's trembling began to subside. It gave a weak bleat. A short while later, they managed to get it to its feet and guide it, stumbling, to its anxious mother. The men stepped back, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, and watched. When the calf finally began to nurse, a collective sigh of relief went through the group. The grizzled cowboy walked over to where Lena's coat lay discarded in the snow, now stained with mud and birth fluid. He picked it up, tried clumsily to brush it off, and held it out to her. "Ma'am," he said, the word a rough, unaccustomed token of respect. "You'll catch your death." She took the coat, a quiet thank you on her lips, and as she and Jack mounted their horses to leave, every man in the camp touched the brim of his hat to her. It was a small gesture, but it was a sea change, a silent, unanimous verdict. They rode back in the early afternoon, the sun at their backs. A comfortable, easy silence settled between them, but the weather in the high country was a fickle beast. On the horizon, a bank of dark, bruised-looking clouds was gathering with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, howling with a sudden, mournful fury. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. Snow flew so thick and fast it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack did not panic. He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowed against the blizzard, and urged his horse onward, leading Lena's mare by the reins. He guided them off the open plain and into a grove of skeletal cottonwoods. Nestled among them was a small, dilapidated structure, an old line shack or granary, abandoned to the elements. "We'll wait it out here," he yelled over the roar of the wind. Inside, the world was dim and quiet, the fury of the storm reduced to a muffled howl. It was a single, dusty room, smelling of old hay and mice, but it was shelter. Jack saw to the horses first, rubbing them down with old sacks he found in a corner. Then, with the same efficient, methodical calm, he used his hatchet to break up a fallen roof beam and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small, sputtering fire to life in the dilapidated stone hearth. The flames pushed back the gloom, casting a warm, flickering orange light on their faces. They sat on a low pile of old hay bales, sipping hot, bitter coffee from a tin flask Jack produced from his saddlebag. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental beast, but inside their small, fragile shelter, there was a profound sense of peace. The events of the day, the majestic sunrise, the desperate struggle for the calf's life, the sudden, violent onset of the storm had stripped away all artifice. Lena felt raw, exposed, and bone-weary. She stared into the flames, watching the wood crumble into glowing embers. "I don't belong anywhere," she whispered. The words spoken so softly they were almost carried away by the wind rattling the old walls. It was not a plea for pity. It was a simple, stark confession, the truest words she had ever spoken, the sum of her entire life. Jack was silent for a long time. He set his coffee cup down. Lena watched him in the firelight. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached down to his hip. He unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy leather making a soft, sighing sound. He coiled it carefully, the worn holster, the heavy Colt revolver, the brass cartridges in their loops, and set it on the dusty floor beside him. It was an act of profound symbolism. He was setting aside his armor, his weapon, the tool and emblem of his authority and self-reliance. He was disarming himself, not just physically but spiritually. He was making the space between them a place of absolute peace. He turned to her, his face serious in the firelight, his slate-gray eyes holding hers. "You belong here," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that was a counterpoint to the storm's chaos. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the lifetime of disbelief. He leaned a fraction closer, his voice dropping even lower, imbued with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "You do now." The winter festival was the town's collective act of defiance against the season. For one night, Dusty Hollow shed its hard, practical shell and remembered how to celebrate. The town hall, usually a cavern of cold drafts and solemn pronouncements, was transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm, honeyed glow that softened the hard edges of the room. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of potluck offerings, venison pies, roasted prairie chickens, tubs of baked beans, and sweet, sticky cakes made with molasses and dried apples. At one end of the room, a fiddler and a man with a banjo had set up on a low platform, their lively, foot-stomping tunes a vibrant counterpoint to the howl of the wind outside. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, pine boughs, and damp wool, and the sound was a cheerful chaos of laughter, shouted conversations, and music. Lena entered with May, stepping out of the frigid darkness and into the river of warmth and light. A hush, subtle but immediate, fell over the conversations nearest the door. Heads turned, eyes found her. But for the first time, Lena did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze or shrink into herself. The week since the blizzard had forged something new inside her. The memory of Jack's words in the abandoned shack. "You belong here." "You do now" had become a quiet, internal fire, a source of steady, unwavering warmth. She stood straight, her shoulders back, her head held high, and she let them look. Tonight, she had given them something to look at. She wore a dress of her own making, a creation born from the humblest of materials. The week before, Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, had given her a bolt of dark blue calico that had been water damaged at one end, rendering it unsellable. From the good cloth, she had fashioned a dress of striking simplicity. It had a high neck, long, fitted sleeves, and a skirt that fell in a clean, straight line to the floor. It was unadorned with the ruffles and lace favored by the other women. Its only decoration the perfection of its cut and the precision of its stitches. It was a dress that spoke not of wealth or status, but of skill, dignity, and a quiet, unshakable self-respect. She had woven her newfound strength into its very seams. The gazes that fell upon her were different tonight. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a complex cocktail of curiosity, grudging respect, and outright awe. The story of the calf had become a local legend, repeated in the saloon and over fences. The woman they had dismissed as a fragile outsider had knelt in the snow and wrestled life back from the brink of death. She was no longer just a seamstress. She was a woman of substance, a woman of unexpected grit. She saw the men from the Bar T ranch clustered near the back wall, one by one. They caught her eye and gave her a slow, deliberate nod of respect. It was a greeting between equals. She found a quiet spot near the wall with May, content to observe. She watched families laughing, young couples stealing shy glances, and old-timers telling tall tales. For the first time, she did not feel like an intruder looking in at a life she could never be a part of. She felt a tentative, fragile connection to the rhythm of this community, to their shared struggle against the harshness of the land and their shared need for a night of simple joy. She was a part of this town's story now, whether they fully accepted her or not. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't see him approach. A space simply cleared in the crowd, and suddenly, he was there. Jack Delaney moved without hurry, a calm, solid presence in the cheerful chaos. He had shed his heavy sheepskin coat and wore a clean, dark shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His face was scrubbed clean, and his dark hair was neatly combed. He looked different, more formal, but the quiet intensity in his slate-gray eyes was the same. He walked directly to her, his gaze never leaving her face, and the crowd seemed to instinctively part before him. He stopped in front of her. The fiddler started a new tune, a slow, melodic waltz that cut through the boisterous energy of the room. A space began to clear in the center of the floor as a few couples started to dance. Jack looked at Lena, a faint, almost imperceptible softness in his expression. He held out his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, a hand that knew the feel of reins and rope and an axe handle, and it was offered to her, palm up, in a gesture of simple, profound invitation. "Dance with me," he asked, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the music. Yet, for Lena, it was the only sound in the room. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. To dance with him here, in the center of this room, with every eye and dusty hollow upon them, was to make a public declaration. It was a terrifying, exhilarating prospect. All her old instincts, the ones that had taught her to be invisible, to avoid notice, screamed at her to refuse. "I'm not very good," she heard herself say, the words a nervous whisper. It was an excuse, a shield, in the refined ballrooms of New Orleans. She had been a graceful dancer, but this felt like a different language, a different world. A slow smile touched the corners of Jack's mouth. It was a rare sight, and it transformed his rugged face, lighting it from within. "I'm not asking you to be good," he said, his voice soft, his gaze holding hers with an unwavering steadiness. "I'm asking you to stand beside me." His words struck her with the force of a revelation. He was not asking her to perform. He was not asking her to fit in or to pretend to be someone she wasn't. He was offering her a partnership, a place at his side, here and now, exactly as she was. It was the most honest and profound invitation she had ever received. The last of her fear dissolved, washed away by a rising tide of gratitude and a feeling so new and powerful she could not yet give it a name. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, a solid, reassuring anchor in a swirling sea. He led her to the center of the floor. She was acutely aware of the silence that followed them, of the dozens of eyes watching their progress. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Prentice's cold, disapproving stare from across the room, but for the first time, it had no power over her. Jack turned to face her, placing his other hand gently on the small of her back. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt solid beneath her palm. They stood like that for a beat, in the eye of the storm of gazes, simply looking at each other. And then they began to move. It was not a graceful dance. He was a man more accustomed to the saddle than the dance floor, and she was stiff with a nervousness that had nothing to do with the steps. Their movements were simple, a hesitant shuffle at first, but Jack was a steady, confident lead. He did not try for fancy turns or elaborate steps. He simply held her, guiding her in a slow circle, his body a solid, protective presence. Lena stopped thinking about the steps. She stopped thinking about the people watching. She focused on the feeling of his hand in hers, the warmth of his palm on her back, the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing. She looked up at his face, at the strong line of his jaw, at the quiet concentration in his eyes as he looked down at her. The rest of the world, with its noise and its judgment, began to fade away, until there was only the music, the warm lantern light, and the solid, undeniable reality of the man holding her. Slowly, her body began to relax. Her steps became more confident. Matching his, they found a rhythm together, a simple, unadorned harmony that was uniquely theirs. It wasn't about performance or perfection. It was about connection. It was about standing together, in the center of their world, and moving as one. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, and in his eyes, she saw an answering warmth. The music swelled, the fiddles mournful, sweet melody filling the space around them. And as they circled the floor, Lena Callahan knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Jack Delaney had not just asked her to dance, he had invited her home. The thaw that had begun in Lena's heart after the winter festival was slow and cautious, like the first trickles of meltwater in spring. The town's perception of her had shifted from suspicion to a kind of grudging respect, cemented by Jack Delaney's public gesture of standing by her side. She was no longer just the mixed-blood seamstress. She was Miss Callahan, a woman who had earned her place through skill, grit, and the quiet endorsement of the most respected man in the valley. A fragile peace had settled over her life, and for the first time, she dared to imagine a future that was not defined by escape. This peace was shattered by the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach on a Tuesday. It was not the usual dusty, rattling affair, but a newer, handsomer Concord coach, its lacquered panels gleaming, pulled by a team of 4 matched grays. It was a vehicle of wealth and importance, and it brought the town to a standstill. From it stepped a man who seemed to belong to a different world. He was dressed in a finely tailored Eastern suit, a cashmere greatcoat draped over his shoulders, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was handsome in a smooth, cultivated way, with a confident smile and eyes that seemed to assess the value of everything they landed on. Lena was in Henderson's general store, purchasing a spool of black thread. When he entered, the store's bell jingled, and a wave of cold, perfumed air followed him in. She turned from the counter, and her world stopped. The spool of thread slipped from her numb fingers and rolled, unnoticed, across the floorboards. Her breath seized in her lungs, and a cold dread, ancient and familiar, washed over her, extinguishing the fragile warmth she had so carefully nurtured. The man was Julian Croft. He was the son of her father's business partner in New Orleans, the architect of her family's ruin. He was the man who had once courted her with pretty words and false promises, only to abandon her with a cruel, dismissive sneer the moment her family's fortune evaporated. He was the final, devastating embodiment of the life she had fled, a ghost of the past made flesh and blood, standing here in the heart of her sanctuary. He scanned the rustic interior of the store with an air of amused condescension, his gaze sliding past her without a flicker of recognition. He was looking for someone, and when the door opened again and Mr. Prentice, the banker, and Alistair Finch bustled in, all smiles and obsequious gestures, it was clear he had found them. "Mr. Croft, welcome to Dusty Hollow," Prentice boomed. "We are honored by your visit." "The honor is all mine, gentlemen," Croft replied, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was an assault on the quiet, plain-spoken air of the store. "I trust my preliminary survey team has made my intentions clear." Indeed, Finch chirped, his earlier dismissal of Lena seemingly forgotten in the presence of this important visitor. "The Transcontinental Mining and Exploration Company. It sounds most impressive. We are all eager to hear your proposal." Lena stood frozen, hidden behind a tall stack of flour sacks, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mining, land, that's why he was here. He had brought the same rapacious ambition that had destroyed her father to this quiet corner of the world. She watched, unseen, as they spoke. Croft was a master of his craft. He spoke of progress, of prosperity, of a railroad spur that would connect Dusty Hollow to the markets of the East. He painted a glittering picture of a future where every landowner would be rich, every man would have a job, and the town would blossom into a jewel of the territory. Prentice and Finch listened with rapt attention, their faces glowing with avarice. A few days later, the purpose of Croft's visit became the sole topic of conversation in town. The Transcontinental Mining Company wanted to buy mineral rights to the land in the valley, particularly the vast tracts of the Bar T Ranch, which geological surveys suggested were rich in silver deposits. A town meeting was called. The night before the meeting, Jack came to May's house. He did not come for mending. He entered without knocking, his face set in grim, hard lines. He looked tired, a deep, weary anger in his eyes. "He came to see me this afternoon," Jack said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Croft." Lena's hands, which had been darning a sock, went still. "He wants the bar tea," Jack continued, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "All of it. He made an offer, a generous one." He looked at Lena, his gaze direct. "I told him the land wasn't for sale." And May prompted gently. A muscle worked in Jack's jaw. "And he told me that was a foolish answer. He said his company has powerful friends. He spoke of land claims being disputed, of water rights being challenged. He suggested that cattle drives might run into unforeseen difficulties. He said that a man who stands in the way of progress often finds himself crushed by it. It was the same strategy, the same insidious blend of charm and menace that had ruined her father. Croft didn't use fists or guns. He used lawyers, ledgers, and the relentless, grinding power of money. "He is a man who breaks things." "Jack," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "He breaks people. He breaks promises." Jack looked at her, his expression softening. He saw the fear in her eyes, the shadow of a past she had never spoken of but that he had always sensed was there. He took a step closer. "He can't hurt you here." "Lena." "It's not me I'm worried about," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's you. It's this valley." The town hall was packed. Every rancher, shopkeeper, and homesteader for 50 miles was present. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of wet wool. Julian Croft stood at the front of the room, flanked by Prentice and Finch, a picture of urbane confidence. He delivered his speech with practiced ease, his words painting a future of such dazzling prosperity that a murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. He spoke of turning rock into riches, of bringing the modern world to their doorstep. When he was finished, he opened the floor to questions. An old rancher stood up to ask about grazing rights. A shopkeeper asked about the timeline for the railroad. Croft answered them all with smooth, reassuring confidence. He was winning them over. Jack had not spoken. He sat on a bench near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Croft knew Jack was his primary obstacle. "Mr. Delaney," Croft said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "You are the largest landowner in this valley. We have not yet heard from you. Surely you can see the great benefit this enterprise will bring to all your neighbors." Every eye in the room turned to Jack. He did not move. And in that moment, Lena knew she could not stay silent. She could not watch this serpent charm his way into another Eden and poison it from within. Everything she had learned in Dusty Hollow, the quiet strength from May, the unconditional acceptance from Jack, the hard-won respect from the town coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the train. She stood up. Her movement was quiet, but it was so unexpected that a hush fell over the room. Croft turned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. His eyes met hers, and this time, he recognized her. A slow, cruel smile of amusement spread across his lips. He thought he knew her. He thought she was a broken thing he had left behind. "It seems we have a question from the gallery," he said, his tone mocking. "Do you have an opinion on mineral rights?" Miss Lena did not look at him. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, the men whose clothes she had mended, the women who had come to trust her skill. "My name is Lena Callahan," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "I do not have an opinion on mineral rights, but I do have an opinion on the character of men." A confused murmur went through the crowd. Croft's smile tightened. "I came to this town with nothing," Lena continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her. "Some of you looked at me with suspicion, but you gave me a chance. You judged me on my work. You saw what my hands could do. You learned who I was by what I did, not by what I promised." She paused, then turned her eyes, for the first time directly on Julian Croft. I knew a man in New Orleans, a man who dressed in fine clothes and spoke with a silver tongue. He made grand promises to my father, promises of partnership and prosperity. My father was a good man. He was an honest man. He believed in the power of a handshake. He trusted him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet, damning testimony held the room in a rapt silence. Croft's face had gone pale, his confident smirk vanishing, replaced by a look of cold fury. "This man," Lena said, her voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat, "used that trust to ruin him. He used contracts with hidden clauses and ledgers with false entries, and the power of his family's wealth to strip my father of his business, his good name, and his will to live. He left my family with nothing but shame and whispers. He did not do it with a gun. He did it with a smile and with a pen." The silence in the room was now absolute, as profound and heavy as the winter snow outside. Every person was looking from Lena's dignified, sorrowful face to Croft's, which was now a mask of barely controlled rage. "A man's character is not a coat he can change when he travels to a new town," Lena finished, her voice ringing with a simple, unshakable truth. "The man who stands before you tonight promising riches is the same man who delivered ruin to my family. I ask you only to consider this: what is the true price of the progress he is offering you?" She sat down. The silence held for a long, breathless moment. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was the grizzled old cowboy from the bar T whose jacket she had patched. Then another joined in, and another. The applause spread, not in a wild explosion, but as a slow, rolling wave of validation, a thunderous affirmation of her courage and her truth. It was the sound of a community choosing character over coin. Croft, his face white with fury, turned on Jack. "Delaney, are you going to let this fanciful tale from a ruined woman dictate the future of this town, your land, man? Think of the money." Slowly, Jack Delaney rose to his feet. He leaned slightly on a simple walking stick he sometimes used, a gnarled piece of ash that seemed an extension of his own grounded strength. He did not look at Croft. He looked at Lena, and in his eyes there was a fierce, protective pride that was more intimate than any embrace. He then turned his gaze to the assembled townspeople. "I don't need the land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "If it means losing someone I trust." The words were a death blow. He had not just rejected the offer, he had passed judgment on the man who made it. He had stood with Lena, and in doing so, the entire town stood with her. Julian Croft stared for a moment, his mask of civility utterly shattered, revealing the raw, ugly snarl of a thwarted predator. He spat a curse, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the town hall, slamming the door behind him. He was gone from Dusty Hollow before the next morning's sun had risen. The departure of Julian Croft was not a loud, celebratory event. It was a quiet exhalation, the collective release of a breath the town hadn't realized it was holding. His fancy carriage rolled out of Dusty Hollow in a cloud of dust and sullen silence, and with it went the glittering, hollow promises of a future that the valley had wisely chosen to refuse. The Transcontinental Mining and Exploration Company faded back into the eastern ether from whence it came, becoming a cautionary tale told by old-timers on cold winter nights. In the aftermath, a new kind of quiet settled over Lena. The town meeting had been a crucible, burning away the last of her fear and uncertainty. She had stood before the community, laid her past bare, and they had not turned away. Instead, they had listened, and they had believed her. In defending the valley, she had inadvertently claimed her place within it. The looks she received on the street were no longer tinged with suspicion or grudging respect. They were looks of genuine warmth, of camaraderie. She was no longer May's girl or the seamstress. She was Miss Lena, or, to the men from the bar T, simply Callahan, a name spoken with the same casual respect they afforded each other. The transactional nature of her existence began to dissolve, replaced by the intricate, interwoven threads of a real life. Her business, born of necessity and a pile of mending, began to flourish. Mr. Henderson, impressed by her quiet integrity, offered her the small, abandoned storefront next to his general store for a modest rent. It had been a cobbler's shop once, and the air inside was thick with the ghost smell of leather and wax. With May's help, and with a surprising amount of volunteer labor from a few of the bar tea cowboys who proved far more adept with a hammer than they were with a needle, they transformed it. They scrubbed the floors, patched the roof, and installed a large window that flooded the space with natural light. And Lena opened her own shop. Above the door, on a simple, hand-carved plank of pine, Jack painted a single word in clean, black letters, seamstress. It was more than a business. It became a nexus, a quiet center of gravity in the town's daily life. It started simply. A rancher's wife would come in to have a dress altered and would stay for a cup of tea, her conversation drifting from hemlines to the challenges of raising children on the prairie. Lena, remembering the complex Creole recipes of her mother, would share a tip for making a tough cut of venison tender. And soon, women were stopping by not just for her skill with a needle, but for her quiet wisdom in the kitchen. Then the children started coming. It began with a little girl named Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, who watched Lena's hands with wide, curious eyes. One day, Lena gave her a scrap of calico and a blunt needle and showed her how to make a simple running stitch. Soon, Sarah brought a friend, and then another. On Tuesday afternoons, the shop would be filled with the sound of childish concentration. A half-dozen small heads bent over their clumsy first attempts at sewing, their brows furrowed in imitation of Lena's own focused expression. She was not just mending clothes, she was mending the fabric of the community, stitching the next generation into its traditions. Mrs. Prentice, who now offered Lena a stiff but correct nod when they passed on the street, was even heard to remark that the girls in town were showing a sudden and remarkable improvement in their domestic arts. Through it all, Jack was a constant, steady presence. His visits were no longer tied to the practicalities of ranch mending. He came every day, usually in the late afternoon when the sun was low and the day's work was winding down. He would bring her things: a brace of sage grouse for her and May's supper, a curiously shaped piece of driftwood he'd found by the creek, a handful of early spring wildflowers. Often, he brought nothing at all. He would simply pull up a stool by her work table, sip a cup of coffee, and watch her hands as they moved, his presence a silent, grounding comfort. Their conversations were rarely profound. They spoke of the weather, of the cattle, of the news from the weekly paper. But beneath the surface of their simple words, a deeper language was being spoken. It was in the way his gaze would soften when she smiled, in the way she would find her own hands slowing when he was near, her focus shifting from her work to the simple, profound pleasure of his company. Sometimes, when the last of the afternoon light was fading and the shop was quiet, he would reach across the table and take her hand. He would simply hold it, his large, calloused fingers enveloping hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand where the needle had pricked it 100 times. In those moments, no words were needed. His touch spoke of protection, of partnership, of a deep and abiding tenderness that went beyond language. It was a silent promise that she was no longer alone. One evening, in the deep blue of twilight, Lena stood on the boardwalk outside her shop, sweeping the last of the day's threads and scraps into a dustpan. The air was crisp and clean, and the first star of the evening was a diamond spark in the darkening sky. She looked up at the sign above her door. Seamstress. It was a good word, an honest word. It was the word that had saved her. But it was no longer the whole story. The next day, she asked Jack to take the sign down. That afternoon, she took a small brush and a pot of the same black paint, and with a steady, practiced hand, she added to it. A few days later, after the paint had dried, Jack rehung the sign. That evening, As the last customer left and the day drew to a close, Lena once again stood on the boardwalk and looked up. Callahan and Company. The words seemed to glow in the twilight. Her name, claimed, solid, and undeniable. And beside it, that small, hopeful addendum and Company. It spoke of partnership, of community, of the children who learned at her side and the women who shared her recipes. It spoke of May's steadfast kindness and of the gruff cowboys who had hammered her roof into place. It spoke of a life that was no longer lived in solitude, but was inextricably woven into the lives of others. A slow, genuine laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The woman who had arrived in this town with a single, shabby bag and the crushing certainty that she belonged nowhere, now had her name etched into the very heart of the main street. She had stitched herself a home. The bell above the shop door jingled softly, pulling her from her reverie. Jack stepped out onto the boardwalk. Shrugging into his heavy coat, he saw the direction of her gaze and the smile on her face. He looked up at the sign, then back at her, and his own rare, slow smile answered hers. "It suits you," he said. He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers, and together they watched the sky deep into indigo and the town settle into the quiet peace of the evening. Later, inside the warm, lamp-lit shop, she was banking the fire in the small stove for the night. Jack was preparing to leave, pulling on his gloves. He paused by the door, and as had become his habit whenever he entered a place where he intended to stay, he reached down and unbuckled his heavy gun belt. He coiled it with practiced efficiency and placed it on the small, sturdy table by the door. Lena stopped what she was doing and watched him. She had seen him perform this small ritual 100 times, in May's house and now here, in her shop. It was a gesture of peace, a signal that he was shedding the burdens and dangers of the outside world. But tonight, she felt a need to understand it more deeply. She turned to him, her face soft in the warm glow of the lantern. "Why do you always do that?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Put your gun down like that." Jack looked at the coiled belt resting on the table, the polished wood of the Colt's grip gleaming in the lamplight. Then he looked at her, and his eyes held a lifetime of unspoken truths, of lonely trails and hard-won battles. The smile that touched his lips was filled with a gentle, profound certainty. "Because I'm home," he said. "Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from in the comments below, so we can all share our thoughts and connect. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. It would also be a great support if you could press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.